Lecturer Kieran O'Mahony, who's an Augustinian friar and a biblical scholar. You've probably heard of Kieran himself. He worked for 22 years in Milltown Institute of Theology and Philosophy, and for 9 years then as coordinator of biblical studies for the Archdiocese of Dublin. He currently lives in Donnybrook, where he works a busy man between parish and between study and giving courses like this. He's also maintains a wonderful website which is called, and you mark this down, this is your first note, tarsus.ie. Okay, tarsus.ie. That's your first note now for today. So it offers commentary on current liturgical readings and commentaries and an awful lot else besides. It's a rich source for anybody. A wonderful source, actually, Kieran. Over the next few days, he'll look at how scripture and climate and environment will pinch in together. This is our current theme running through the season itself here at Knock. So I hope that you'll enjoy. We give him a nice warm welcome and thank him for being here, and he'll take you over. I hope you enjoy the next few days. You certainly will. I can vouch for him, and I can vouch for your enjoyment and also for the knowledge that you'll glean. I just want to thank Martin as well, who's down there and who's our tech genius and guru, who keeps us linked up with the internet, and all who join us online as well. So you're very, very welcome. Good to see you here, and enjoy.
Richard, thanks very much for the warm welcome here. Great to be here with everybody and people online as well. There are much more online than actually physically present. So good morning, everybody, and welcome. Do you want to make a bit of room for yourselves so there's a bit more space? There's one man's coming in here. Just to say, in case you think I'm winking at you, I have trouble with my right eye. So I'm seeing double. So there are quite a few of you present. So if I'm to see properly, I have to close one eye. I have a patch, but when I'm on television, vanity prevents me from wearing it. So welcome in any case to our couple of days, and a warm welcome to the people joining us online. Here for people present, the full set of notes has been distributed. It's really all the biblical texts I'll be dealing with, and it would be handy to have that with you each day. There are a couple of spare copies around if you happen to forget. And for people joining us online, if you haven't printed out the text, it might be a time to do it, because this morning we'll do a little bit of engagement with the text with pen and paper, just to get us going. As you can imagine, the program is inspired by the great initiative of Pope Francis, Laudato Si. And while I won't deal with Laudato Si directly, we're looking at the biblical texts for care of creation and for care of the environment, for our human home. And in my mind, there are three super important documents of Pope Francis. They're all obvious, but it's no harm just to draw attention. I think his one on the joy of the gospel is underrated. I think it's a really significant document. Pardon? No, it's Evangelii Gaudium. He does have a tone of joy now throughout all his documents, so he's great. I think that's a very important one, because it takes us to the core of gospel believing. And I do believe that while we live in anxious times, joy is the mark of the inner freedom of the Christian. And so it's a real call to be free. So I think it's a significant document. The other one that he produced was Laudato Si. So that's the presenting issue of our day. I mean, all of us are bombarded all the time with kind of rather frightening cumulative news about the environment. And we know that something has to be done, and we try and do our best in our own little worlds as far as we can. And then I think the other one that's important for him is the document Fratelli Tutti, probably also not read so widely. They left it in Italian because it means brothers all. I suppose it would have been difficult to have brothers and sisters all, but I don't see why not. Fratelli e sorelle tutte, it works in Italian. But it's a call to social justice and to solidarity and to work for peace. And to me, those three things are really a kind of prophetic voice for us today, a counter voice to much in our world, as we know kind of tragically that the sense of solidarity and working for good, that's obviously absent in many parts of the world. So Pope Francis is quite a prophetic voice for us today. I think those three little pieces to me are very important. And if you ask yourself, what do prophets do? Prophets call us to have an alternative perception of reality to escape from the imposition of conventional views. It's very important what prophets do, you know. And it's slightly odd, of course, that our chief pastor is a prophet, because in history, popes often were not prophetic. In fact, they bought into a whole institutional system of power and glory. But we fortunately live at a time where the Bishop of Rome has kind of released himself from the heavy inheritance of his predecessors. As you know, he lives more simply, he speaks more simply, he writes from the head and the heart. So we live at a very fortunate moment, and it's important that we should pray for him. Not that I want him to work until he dies. I mean, I think he should retire at some point and have a bit of rest and making of his soul. But he is a good man, and he's calling us to prophetic living, really. And so that has inspired the program here in Knock. So I've picked biblical texts, to be honest, ones that I like a lot. So you're allowed to do that at this age of my life. So this is what I had in mind. So reading Genesis 1 to 2, 3 actually. And then I'm going to ask, I'll read that through with you, and then I'm going to ask you to, and people at home as well, to observe repetitions. And there are, it's quite significantly rhythmic, the telling of Genesis chapter 1, and to observe the sequence. That's quite carefully laid out, including funny things. You will notice that there's evening and morning on the first day, but no sun and moon. You might say, oops, how did they manage that? In any case, any question that you might like to ask about the text, and then I'm going to go through it, kind of comb through it a bit, kind of verse by verse, and then I'm going to go on to talk about the broader context of when this might have been written, because that is significant for our understanding of the whole text today. Does that make some sense as a starting point? Yeah. Great. Did you want to say a brief word about what brought you here, just to welcome you and hear your voice? Maybe not, but if you'd like to.
Just interest in learning more.
Yeah, okay, just interest in learning more as a voice. And that's true of all of us, I guess. Huh?
The title drew me.
Oh, very good, okay. Yeah. Good. I hope to show during showing the various texts that there's a joy in creation in the biblical text. I mean, very beautiful. I'm very attached to that long hymn in Sirach that we'll do on the fourth presentation. Very beautiful poem about nature and reality. And Sirach is often a bit neglected. He's not so read so widely. Now, there's reason for neglecting him. He was a curmudgeonly misogynist, but he was good on creation. Poor man. Anybody else like to say what?
Well, I came to make a 6-day retreat privately.
Yeah.
I'm talking to everybody.
Grand. So, I don't know, that's an elevation for us. This is part of someone's retreat. That's very good.
I was here last year, so I could be forward the same.
Okay, grand. Grand. Very good, okay.
We did the school day.
Yeah. Correct.
I think I was a doer all my life, so it's a wonderful opportunity just to
Stand back and
stand back
receive a bit, huh?
and receive what I
Yeah.
what I would have not have been able to.
Yeah, I understand that. We often lead very busy lives, especially religious, huh? Endlessly busy. Good. Well, then I thought, what I've done here on the handout, just to show you, is the story of creation from the book of Genesis. Okay, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, in fact. Now, I've put down the text twice, and you might say that's very excessive. Here is the first text is a translation of the Hebrew. Do you see that? That's the first one. And overleaf in a slightly different, lighter font. Do you see it? is a translation of the Greek Old Testament. That's on page 3. A translation of the Greek Old Testament. I don't know if you're familiar with the expression the Septuagint. This is the translation of the Greek Old Testament way back, 2nd century BC. Now here's a peculiarity. I hope, are you bracing yourselves? The translation in Greek represents an older version of the Hebrew than the surviving Hebrew. That can happen, because the Hebrew text evolved. And the best text of the Hebrew Bible is the Aleppo Codex from the 8th century AD. So, not ancient, really, but the Septuagint is older. And so there are differences with the and we'll see that from time to time in the commentary. So I thought what I might ask you to do is, I'm going to read it. I'm going to ask you to take out your pen and notice where you see things like, and it was so, and it was good. Those kind of repetitions, and then to notice the shape of the telling. See if you can spot any kind of a pattern, which I'll pull out myself eventually. And I was going to take the risk of reading the English of the Hebrew text and also the English of the Greek text. And I thought we might divide ourselves. And would these people pay attention to the Greek text? And these people pay attention to the Hebrew text. At home, you can decide yourself. Anyway, here goes. You might find even the beginning a little bit different. This is the NRSV updated edition, so the most recent version of the NRSV. Now, so what I'm asking you to do is to underline with your pen patterns of repetition, okay? When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. It was so. He called the dome sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the night from the day, and let them be for signs and for seasons and days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. And God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. And God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make humans in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild beasts of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humans in his image. In the image of God he created them. That should literally be him. Male and female he created them. The them is okay then the second time. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves upon the earth. And God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and everything that creeps upon the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. So initially, everybody is vegan, humans and animals, in our language. And it was so. And God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Then thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. On the sixth day God finished the work he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. That's the translation of the Hebrew. This is a translation of the Greek. So possibly an older text, maybe a little bit more complete. Different language now, we switch languages a bit. In the beginning God made the sky and the earth. Yet the earth was invisible and unformed, and darkness was over the abyss, and a divine wind was being carried over the water. God said, let light come into being, and light came into being. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God separated between the light and between the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And it came to be evening, and it came to be morning, day one. And God said, let a firmament come into being in the midst of the water, and let it be a separator between water and water. And it became so. And God made the firmament, and God separated between the water that was under the firmament and between the water that was above the firmament. And God called the firmament sky, and God saw that it was good, and it came to be evening, and it came to be morning, a second day. And God said, let the water that is under the sky be gathered into one gathering, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And the water that was under the sky was gathered into their gatherings, and the dry land appeared. And God called the dry land earth, and the systems of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth put forth herbaceous vegetation, seeding plant according to kind and according to likeness, and a fruit-bearing tree producing fruit with its seeds in it according to kind on the earth. And it became so. And the earth brought forth herbaceous vegetation, seeding seed according to the kind and according to likeness, and a fruit-bearing tree producing fruit of which its seed is in it according to its kind on the earth. And God saw that it was good. And it came to be evening, and it came to be morning, a third day. Then we'll continue. And God said, let luminaries, this doesn't mean important human beings anyway, let luminaries come into being in the firmament of the sky for illumination of the earth, to separate between day and between night. And let them be signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for illumination in the firmament of the sky, so that it would light upon the earth. And it became so. And God made the two great luminaries, the great luminary for rulership of the day, and the lesser luminary for rulership of the night, and the stars. And God set them in the firmament of the sky, so as to give light upon the earth, and to rule the day and the night, and to separate between the light and between the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And it came to be evening, and it came to be morning, a fourth day. And God said, let the waters bring forth creeping things among living creatures, and birds flying on the earth against the firmament of the sky. And it became so. And God made the great sea monsters and every creature among creeping animals with which the waters brought forth according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that they were good. And God blessed them, saying, increase and multiply, and fill the earth and the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And it came to be evening, and it came to be morning, a fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to kinds, quadrupeds, and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth according to kind. And it became so. And God made the wild animals of the earth according to kind, and the cattle according to kind, and all the creeping things of the earth according to their kind. And God saw that they were good. Then God said, let us make humankind according to our image and according to likeness, and let them rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and the cattle and all the earth and all the creeping things that creep upon the earth. And God made humankind. According to divine image, he made it. Male and female, he made them. That's a very accurate translation. And God blessed them, saying, increase and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and all the cattle and all the earth and all the creeping things that creep upon the earth. And God said, see, I've given to you any herbage, sowable, sowing seed, which is over all the earth, and any tree that has in itself fruit of sowable seed. To you it shall be for your food. And to all the wild animals of the earth, and to all the birds of the sky, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, that has in itself the animating force of life, and all green herbage for food. And it became so. And God saw all the things he had made, and see, they were exceedingly good. And it came to be evening, and it came to be morning, a sixth day. And the sky and the earth were finished, and all their arrangement. And on the sixth day God finished his works that he had made. And he left off on the seventh day from all his works that he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because he had left off from all his works that God had begun to make. Quite interesting, isn't it? The two different versions. One obviously touched by Greek philosophy. You can see that a little bit in there. Did you have any observations to make about any commentary of any kind? This is a bit clunky, the Greek, huh? The Greek translation is a little bit clunky. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, luminaries rather than light.
Yeah. It's kind of a fancier word. It was a bit harder to read the Greek, yeah, because it was more technical somehow. There's a thing there. Welcome. Any other observations that you'd like to make? The repetitions are fuller in the Greek, and it was so. They're fuller, which may represent an older text which was more complete, and our current Hebrew text is a little bit incomplete as a result. Were you able to follow the patterns of the days? Yeah. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, 5, 6, and the way 4 and 6 are paired. There's a double creation on 4 and a double creation on 6. I'll show you a pattern of that in a moment. That's all kind of on purpose, the way it's laid out. It's laid out. Anything else you'd like to ask about it? I can repeat questions for people at home online.
In Genesis 1:26, when God said, let them make humans,
Yeah,
an accurate translation.
that's accurate, yeah. Accurate in Hebrew and in Greek. It represents the idea that clearly the Hebrews believe in one God at this point. When this was written, which is the exile or just after the exile, they clearly believe in one God. They're pure monotheists. The us is an echo of a heavenly court where God consults and makes decisions. And behind that then a kind of a distant polytheistic background, which this writer, of course, completely rejects.
Do we read that? Sorry, do we read that with Trinitarian?
Well, of course, that's what the church fathers did. If you read, Origen or Augustine or Ambrose, they'll say, "Oh, the us means the Trinity," but that's quite anachronistic, because when this was written, they weren't thinking Trinity. at all. You know, that just isn't part of it. But that's what they did do. They went back and said, oh yeah, that's obviously a hint of the three persons in the Trinity.
And there's no mention of the creation of angels.
No. That's a really good question, because just at this time, they were beginning to think of angels. Before that, angels are just not significant. They're kind of a metaphor for God acting. But then around this time, once they had the experience of being in Persia under Cyrus, and in the Persian religion, which still exists today, Zoroastrianism, had a very developed angelology. And from then on, you begin to see more and more angelic figures with names in the Hebrew Bible. But at this maybe it's a little bit too early for that to appear. And they do have a sense of graded life, as you can see here. There's inanimate life, there's animate life, there's animals with souls, there's humans with souls and mind. And, you know, why they couldn't think of angels in between as like another step, you know, between creation and God. But they didn't think of that here. But it was coming in just at that time, yeah.
You know what occurred to me is a bit off the point. The Ark, Noah's Ark.
That is
How
off.
did they all go on there?
How do you mean? How do they all go on?
Well, I mean, they were all supposed to fit on the Ark.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, I suppose we have to treat these stories as symbolic stories, that there's very little history in them. It's kind of myth, but not myth in the way they use it in the media, meaning false, but myth in the sense of a very profound story with very rich meaning. And so the Noah's Ark is that. And as you know, if you read the story of the Ark, there are two stories stitched together. You might notice sometimes it's 7 animals of every kind and 2 animals of every kind. There's a little bit of a mix-up of all that stuff, but it's carefully stitched together. But there are two stories. And it was a big shock in the 19th century when archaeologists discovered that there were identical stories, only much older, in the area of Mesopotamia. And they got a big shock and they said, oh gosh, I mean, the Bible isn't kind of original to itself. What the Bible is often doing is taking in standard world view and then accommodating it to belief in one God. And that's what we have here, really. I mean, you can see that in the Genesis story when it refuses to name the sun and the moon. I mean, they're perfectly good words for sun and moon in Hebrew and in Greek, but they don't name them because in the culture of the period, the sun and moon were worshipped. So they're not the sun and the moon. It's luminaries created by God for His purposes. No danger of worshipping them, you know. But that's what they're doing. So these, I mean, much, if I can put it like in a brief form, much of the ancient stuff in the Bible is of very little historical value. It can let you into the culture of a period, but as for history, you really don't get history until you come to the time of King David. Then you begin to get something like court chronicles and real history. Before that, you have sagas, legends, symbolic stories, bearers of meaning. And a good question to ask is, when do they come up with these stories? Why do they come up with them? And how do they integrate them into their world view? One of the, as you know, one of the great stories is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story of creation is under the Enuma Elish. And the Enuma Elish means when God. When God. And so our story begins when God. In other words, they're in a tradition. But they have, the term is used in the commentaries, they have demythologized the tradition. They've stepped back from polytheism and from worship of planets and stars and that kind of stuff. They step back from all that. And they step back from the struggle of creation, because in the great creation myths of the Middle East, it's a big battle. Whereas here it's God said, you know, which really means God thought or God willed. But it's a very pure idea of creation. But they stand within a tradition, as you have to. I mean, if somebody wrote a book or wrote a text like this, which had no cultural reference, okay, we wouldn't be able to read it. Because every text has to have a cultural reference. And if somehow God spoke completely independently of human culture, we wouldn't understand. And so That's so it's always within a tradition of some kind. And so our stories here fall well within a recognized Middle Eastern Mesopotamian tradition of stories of origin, with the difference that the whole struggle of good and evil is kind of gone. God simply wills things to be, and that there's goodness, order, and beauty in creation. And so it's quite a strong teaching. It also means it's quite a late teaching. So that even though it's the first chapter in the book of Genesis, it may very well be the last chapter that was added. It's kind of a prologue for a much bigger story. I'll show you some of that towards the end. Yeah.
When was the Hebrew in time? When was it written?
The Hebrew text of this it's a bit tricky to answer the question. So when was the Hebrew text? The oldest Hebrew text surviving is the Aleppo Codex, which is an early medieval AD codex. It's in Jerusalem today, and that's about 1,000 years more after the production of the original text. There are some texts appear in Qumran, and that takes you back then to another layer in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very famously, there's a very almost complete text of the prophet Isaiah was found in Qumran. So that takes you back a bit. But there's a big gap in time. But it's presumed that the Hebrew text began to be collated, created around the reforms of Josiah, so the 7th century BC. The exile was a huge cataclysm, and in exile, 2 versions of Hebrew origins came to be, including one, a priestly one, which is what we're reading here, and they were eventually joined together in the final text of the Bible. That's all a long process of evolution and editing. So, if somebody said to me, when does the Hebrew Bible come from? I would say something like 3rd, 4th, 5th century BC. That's when our Hebrew text comes from. But it continued to evolve, and then in the 2nd century BC, a Greek translation was made that we were reading here, the Septuagint, which survives in early manuscripts. And the Greek translation represents the text at a particular moment, and the text continued to evolve, the Hebrew text. So that's why I was suggesting that the Greek, even though it's not the original language, may reflect an older form of the text, even though it's not the original language. But that can happen in translation and history. Older than the Hebrew, yeah. Strangely, a little paradoxically. But towards the end of the session, I'll say a note about when was this written and why was it written. It's kind of important, I think, to try and picture that. Shall I go on and comment on it a little briefly? Yeah, I won't delay hugely on this, but just to give you a picture. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth, so often in our translations it says in the beginning. But now scholars are moving to the idea that the first sentence should really be when, which continues really in verse 3. When God created the earth, God said, The Enuma Elish, which is a Mesopotamian creation story, begins in the same way. And Enuma means when. So when Elish began to create. So that's in a tradition. And in this version here, it doesn't use the name Yahweh at all for God in Genesis 1. It uses Elohim, which is slightly more abstract. It means the divinity or the deity, something like that. And then it uses a word which is difficult. It uses the word bara for create. This word is used only of God, which is a bit strange in religion. Because usually what we're doing is we're using words from human experience and projecting them onto God. But this word is reserved in the Hebrew Bible completely for God's creation of things. It might not mean exactly creation out of nothing, but it means a very autonomous, sovereign creation. And the heavens and the earth simply means the observable universe, everything. The earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Just to say, complete chaos, it survives in English as tohu and bohu. Did you know that expression used sometimes in English? Tohu vabohu. It's not really known if that's kind of a poetic kind of an expression. Anyway, it means chaos or preceding disorder, a complete chaos, as it says here. And darkness in this picture is not simply the absence of light, but something itself. So there was darkness, independently of light, a phenomenon called darkness they're imagining. And the deep is Tehom. Now, in Middle Eastern Mesopotamian mindset, there was a female personification of the primordial sea called Tiamat. And it's often assumed that the Hebrew word Tehom and Tiamat are related, and that there's an echo of the traditional stories of creation. But here, of course, Tehom is demythologized. I mean, the writer does not believe it's a female dragon of chaos. It's completely an instrument at God's hands. We'll see this again in Sirach, I think pretty strongly. And then the word for wind is ruach, which means wind, breath, breath and spirit. And of course, Christian writers, Mary, like Augustine and Origen, they saw there the Holy Spirit, third person blessed Trinity. But that's probably not quite true. Originally, it's kind of a metaphor and has three layers of meaning. It's put them there in bold. Wind as an agent of God's activities, that's found in the book of Genesis. Wind as God's creative, life-giving, sustaining energy, so wind. And wind as a symbol of God's transcendent presence. That's because wind is powerful and invisible, just like God. And they say they use flame for the same idea. And swept or hovered is, we had this last Sunday's reading. Do you remember, like, I've borne you on eagle's wings? You know that one? That's the hovering. So it's a very nice image. And this is a huge amount of water, the vast expense of cosmic and terrestrial water. I'll show you an artist's impression of what all that would have looked like in a moment. Then God says, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. He called the darkness day, and the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, it was morning, the first day. So this is God's divine word, shattering the silence of the cosmos. We're not meant to think, of course, that God has actually got vocal cords. It's more the thought of God. And then he says, let there be. This uses the word yehi, which is repeated. Yehi, the Hebrew verb for meaning let there be, from which the word Yahweh actually also comes. So there's a little hint of the Yahweh stuff in there. And light, as you can imagine, a symbol of life, joy, justice, deliverance across the Bible. So it's a very important thing. In Psalm 104, which we look at later today, God is described as wrapped in a light of robe. In a robe of light. And then, and there was, is repeated 7 times, as you know. And then reality is filled with God's goodness. So terrific opening salvo, as they say. The separation or differentiation of darkness and light, that becomes a pattern in the creation stories. We separate light and darkness. We separate dry land from sea. We separate the upper water and the lower waters, and the different kinds of animals according to their kind are separated. This was of interest to the people who wrote this text because they were a priestly crowd who were interested in the separated purity laws for foods and for reality. So it's important. And naming confers but this is true anyway. Until we've named something, we can't even think about it. And in the Enuma Elish, it begins, when on high the heaven had not yet been named. So that period before anything was. And then you have evening and morning, which in Hebrew, Erev and Boker, but they literally mean sunset and the break of dawn. Probably less appropriate because we haven't had a sun and moon yet. I can tell you a funny story about that later. Egyptians counted the day from dawn to dawn, but the Mesopotamians counted the day from sunset to sunset. And that still survives, of course, in the Roman liturgy, where you have first Vespers on Saturday and the evening begins with sunset. So it still survives in the Roman liturgy, counting from sunset to sunset. There was evening and there was morning. And God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the dome that separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so. And God called the dome sky. And there was evening, it was morning, the second day. And the word for in Hebrew for the dome is rakia, which has no parallel. It's a little bit difficult to translate. People often imagine it as a big Pyrex bowl planted down over the whole thing, and that kept the waters that were above from crushing in down on top of it, and eventually the land would help with the waters below. In Latin, it was called firmamentum, from which our word then God created the firmament. But it's regarded as kind of a solid sort of a thing. So in Ezekiel we read, this is where the image comes from really, over the heads of the living creatures there was something like a dome, shining like crystal, spread out above their heads. He doesn't mention the Pyrex business there. Anyway, it's all created by the word of the Lord. And it was so used again subsequently. There's no it was good here, which is in the Hebrew text, that's the MT, it was good is missing, but it's present in the Septuagint, which means it maybe had just fallen out of the Hebrew for some reason or other. So just to, again, the older text might be the more accurate one. I'm sure you've often seen this picture before. It's a handy one. And it gives you the idea of the dome. Do you see it here? It's essentially made of bricks in this one. Do you see it? and every so often there are floodgates. Do you see them? And they let in snow, hail, and rain, according to what's going on. And it's all water all around. Do you see it? Everywhere. Above, to right, to left, and also underneath. And we're just lucky that the dome is there to hold up the waters from crushing down on top of us. And we're lucky that the land is there to keep pushing the water back. So it's a very strong sense. And they never imagined this clearly in one place in the Bible because they weren't speculative about how nature worked, really. But they assumed that, like every other construction, it had foundations and pillars. Like a house has foundations and pillars. And, of course, the earth has the columns of the earth. Now, they never saw those. But they imagined that they were there. But it's a useful enough picture, isn't it? Gives you an idea of how they... But it's composite. It's really from all various parts, including Ezekiel. It's Pardon?
Columns of the earth, they were the plates of the earth.
Yeah. Anyway, well, probably not. They really think every construction has foundations, and so likewise the earth has foundations. You know, it's kind of going from their building experience more than anything else. But so it's a worldview, which was commonly accepted in the West until Galileo and company switched the worldview.
The elephant is holding up one part.
Now, you're treating this design as a Rorschach test, and what you say will be very revealing, so be careful. It does look like elephant's legs, doesn't it? Yeah. Anyway, possibly not, eh? It's a Rorschach test. Any case. And God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind on earth, and that bear fruit with seed in it. And it was so. And God brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, it was morning, the third day. So this is the terrestrial dry lands and water. And very important in the minds of the writer, and very important for us today, God gifts the land with generative powers. In other words, they're not inherent. There are no pagan fertility cults. God gifts the land with the power to generate. And the earth is a kind of mediating element between God and the gift of life. Very beautiful. And plants and trees they become very important in the food laws of Judaism. And then the reproductive capacity, so the self-generating life is a gift as well. And of every kind keeps recurring. As you see, there are loads of references, and you can download that yourselves at your... Yes, there is. Yeah, there's a marvelous sense of the richness of everything, and we'll see that very clearly in Psalm 104 and also in the Sirach passage. Very clearly, yeah. And God said, let there be lights in the dome to separate the day and the night, and let them be for signs, otot, and for seasons, moadim, and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. They're just mentioned kind of sideways. And God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and it was evening, it was morning, the fourth day. So now the sun, the moon, the stars get done in. The stars are actually mentioned, but the sun and the moon are not, because locally they were worshipped. And so they simply avoid naming them and to make it clear that they're instruments. And the expression there, signs and seasons, is kind of a double thing, meaning set times. And that means days and years, so counting time, but also counting new moons, festivals, and Sabbaths. Because the writer is the priestly writer, and he's interested in the liturgical sequence of time. And so that's an important link to it with the interest of the time of writing. Because at the time of writing, there was a kind of a re-establishment of the liturgical year within Judaism, what we would call a liturgical year. And stars are neglected because there was a very flourishing astrology, as there is today. You know, people watch their star signs and other nonsense. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and birds fly over the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw it was good. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, there was morning, the fifth day. So again, the generative powers are a gift from God. There's a lovely expression, living creatures, nefesh hayah, meaning animate life, life with soul in it. Very beautiful, eh? Again, and it was so, omitted in the Hebrew text, but present in the Septuagint, as we saw, and the verb for bara again is used. Verse 21 is against the Canaanite creation myths involving sea monsters. This is like the book of Job. Remember in the book of Job, the behemoth and the leviathan, even though there's a lot of chaos in the book of Job, they're under God's thumb, even though we don't always see that. So one of the messages of the book of Job and also the creation narrative is that the powers of chaos will not have the last say. That's something we actually do need to hear today. Yeah? And then for the very first time, we have God bless them. So be fruitful and multiply. So the command then to be fertile. Eh? Lovely moment in the whole thing. And God said, "Let the earth," that's the aretz, "bring forth living creatures of every kind, and cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth, the aretz, of every kind." And it was so. And God made the wild animals of the earth, aretz, of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground, the adamah, of every kind. God saw that it was good. A teacher now would correct all that stuff. But the repetition is on purpose for a kind of emphasis. Eh? So every kind then is the abundance, variety, diversity of life. Eh? And verse 24, cattle, creeping things, and wild animals, all sorts of bugs, everything. Wild animals and creeping things, the earth is adamah, which is a link then to the creation of Adam, the human being. Eh? Now, there's no blessing for the animals, unlike the other things, possibly because they were still felt to be a sort of a threat. And still, it was all good. It's still all good, but no blessing. Eh? Then God said, "Let's make humans in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And God created, bara, humans, Adam, the human. In his image, in the image of God, he created, bara, them. Now the Hebrew has singular there, so it has to be him or it. And male and female, he created them. So as Mary asked, the let us is an echo of the heavenly court, found elsewhere also in the Bible. Humans are Adam. Now they are the climax. This is day 6. But they're not the last word, because there's also day 7. So that's important to keep that. And God shares his administration and custody. Sorry, to go back, the language is image and likeness, that human beings are God's agents. Now you're meant to think of a landowner who isn't always present, but who has people acting on his or her behalf. And God shares the administration and custody of the earth. the image and likeness is kind of functional. Now I'll show you just in the next slide what that could mean. 3 times the word created appears. Did you notice that? God created bara. In the image of God, he bara them. Male and female, he bara them. So this is very strong. This is God's will that these creatures should be. Yeah? And you may have noticed also in the text that the Hebrew breaks into poetry at that point. Did you notice that it was kind of separate lines? And it's true very often in the Bible. When it goes into poetry, it means one of 2 things, sometimes both. It means here's an ancient bit of text when it breaks into poetry, because poetry is older than prose. And it also means very strong emphasis. So when it breaks into poetry, something important is occurring. The creation of human beings at this point.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Does this go so far as to say that we are co-creators? You often it doesn't actually.
This is not saying that, I think. This is not quite saying that. I think sharing administration and custody is a bit cooler, but I think that's what he's saying there.
The problem was
Yeah.
for humanity that we decided that text gave us power to do it.
Yes, it did, yeah. The text was easily abused. And of course, we're very disturbed by let them have dominion. That's very disturbing for us because we know our dominion has not been helpful for creation, as we know, still today. But it's good to see what it would have meant kind of originally. So here's an attempt, just to talk a bit about that image and likeness. In the ancient Near East, the king is the image of God. So the king represents God. Texts of both Mesopotamia and Egypt depict the king as an image of a god representing God on earth, much as a divine statue would. For example, one Mesopotamian letter to the king has, "The father of the king, my lord, was the image of the god Bel, and the king, my lord, is likewise the image of the god Bel." Similarly, an Egyptian text has the god Amun proclaim about the king. This is actually a lovely text. "You are my beloved son, who came forth out of my love, my image that I set on earth. I let you rule the land in peace." Rather beautiful text, actually. But you get the idea then of the image, don't you? Very different idea. In Christian and later Christian speculation, the image and likeness was down to the spiritual part of man, so the human being's soul, so to speak. But that's probably not what the writers have in mind. It's much more functional. The human being will represent God in relation to the earth, rather than any particular dimension of the human being that somehow elevates the human being different from the other animals. It's very rather. Pardon? Oh yes, yeah. And that's true. You see, these texts, all our holy texts, have got cultural references, that are, because as I said to you earlier, if God spoke to us in an uncultured way, we wouldn't be able to read it. Everything has to come in a language, a culture, a way of expressing it. Yes. It's working within the conventions of the day, as always. So I put there one of my own smart alecky comments: low self-esteem, not an issue, about His Majesty. The big difference is now that in the book of Genesis, it's not just the king, but all human beings are in God's image and likeness. That's a big difference. Not just the ruler, the person on top of the pile. That's huge. At the end, that'll become significant at the end of and looking back over the whole thing. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Now, subdue it is hard, isn't it? "And dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves upon the earth." And God said, "See, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And every creature, every beast of the earth, and every bird of the sky, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, everything that has a breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." So this is a very extensive blessing. And this time, God moves from the third person to the second person. So God is speaking to the human beings. Now, He didn't simply bless the plants and the fish. Now He's talking to them, which means that the human beings are in a second person, unmediated relationship with God. Very beautiful, important moment in the text. As I said earlier, subdue is difficult for us, and we really have to see it in terms of administration and custody, care. The Bible represents humanity not as the owner of nature, but as its steward, strictly accountable to the true owner. And this theology is one of the important, a source of one of the important institutions of the sabbatical and jubilee year. Do you know those rules in the Old Testament? That the land was to rest every 7 years, and there was to be a jubilee year every 7 sevens, every 49. It's not known if that was ever actually practiced in terms of the big jubilee year every 50 years, because that would be chaotic and could lead to starvation. But the idea was that you had to care for it, and there's a lovely spirituality of sabbatical and jubilee year in the Old Testament. And everybody at the start is vegan, which would be tricky for us. Huh? And it was so. And God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, it was morning, the sixth day. So this is a very open-ended approval of everything, isn't it? It was very good. And in Hebrew, when it says day 1, day 2, day 3, there's no definite article in front. It doesn't say that first day. It simply says day 1. But when it comes to the sixth day, it says the sixth day, to link it with the seventh day. So that this moment, So the article is missing for the first 5. That's a tiny little note on the way the text works. And then you have, this creates a bit of problem. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude, and on the sixth day, now the Hebrew text has the seventh day. God finished the work that he had done, and he rested, Shabbat, on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God had rested, Shabbat, from all the work that he had done in creation. Now we have this 6+1 pattern, and actually God is the climax of the story of creation, not human beings. It's not anthropocentric in that sense. The Hebrew text had seventh day here, which created a problem, because it made it look as if God was still working on the seventh day. In other words, God was breaking the Sabbath. And so the early translations changed that. So the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Syriac all have the sixth. But of course, it's highly likely that the seventh is correct, because the need to correct it tells you that there was a problem with the seventh. And so seventh is probably original. They want to avoid the idea that God was still working on the seventh day. And this day then is given a very special blessing. Later generation, around the time of St. Paul, they did wonder, could God stop creating? And they said, God can no more stop creation than a fire can stop burning. It's part of God's being. So they rejigged the translation, and they didn't say God rested, because that would mean God would stop creation. If God stopped creation, everything would simply cease to exist. And that would be very problematic. So they said, God, instead of saying God rested, they said God gave rest. And this little wriggle around. And that little problem explains an interesting text in John chapter 5. Do you remember in John chapter 5, there's a dispute over Jesus healing on the Sabbath, the man who was 37 years at the pool of Siloam. And Jesus says, my Father is still working, and so am I. Very interesting sentence. In other words, it's reflecting the later Jewish philosophical opinion that God could not be creator. So he did not stop creating on the seventh day. So God is still working, my Father is still working, and so am I. Therefore, it's okay to heal on the Sabbath. So John chapter 5.
A lot of people don't believe in evolution, but that is really evolution.
This is evolution, yeah. This is, I mean, sometimes the creationists try to connect this story with stages of evolution, but I think that's very artificial. This is poetry. It's teaching that everything has its origin in the will and mind of God. There's goodness, beauty, and order in creation, and it all fits together in all its marvelous diversity and uniqueness. And that's really what it's teaching. It's not teaching anything other than that. Mary has heard me tell this story before. I ran into a bunch of fundamentalists once, and they asked me if I would like to talk about the Bible. So I said, I'd love to talk about the Bible. And they said, did I believe in evolution or creation? And I said, God is great. I don't see why God couldn't create by means of evolution. Yeah. And they said, but in the Bible it says, dum, day 1, day 2, day 3. We're saying what's on the page. So I said, that's a poetic way of saying goodness, beauty, and order, and so on. And then they came back to me. So I said, look, the sun and moon were created on the fourth day. How come there was evening and morning on the first day? And they said, It was a different kind of day. And I said, you're interpreting. So then anyway, they backed off.
Story, you know,
Pardon?
a man telling a story.
Yeah.
You know, and I think Genesis, for me anyway, it seems to make sense that this was a story.
This is a story.
And you know, he's not doing his job of work, so he needs light.
Yeah. And it's,
But light is light.
Yeah.
But he builds a house in the first 3 days, and then
yes, it's beautiful. I'll show you the pattern in a moment. It's very beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. The best way to treat it is it's kind of symbolic poetry. That's what we're dealing. We're not dealing with anything that relates to the stage of evolution or cosmology, really, even by accident. They're speaking the language of their day, you know, when God created the Enuma Elish, speaking with within a culture, of course. But also they're taking a very strong stance that suddenly everything is a gift, including the generative powers of creation. There are no fertility cults, no worshipping of planets, stars, sun, moon. Human beings are all radically equal. Every human being is the representative of God on earth, not just the king. So this is a marvelous spirituality in this opening chapter of the book of Genesis. Terrific piece of writing. I'll show you a couple of things about it. Just a comment that I couldn't resist putting in from a writer I admire greatly, Walter Brueggemann. Do you know his work? He wrote a great book called The Prophetic Imagination that kind of everybody should read, really. Anyway, in The Prophetic Imagination, he says this: Sabbath, in the first instance, is not about worship. It's about work stoppage. It's about withdrawal from the anxiety system of Pharaoh. The refusal to let one's life be defined by production and consumption and the endless pursuit of private well-being. Fantastic sentence from Walter Brueggemann on what Sabbath is about. And that's true because in the time of exile, when the Sabbath became officially kind of legislated, what they were doing was they were saying, we are not defined by our present status, you know, as exiles and slaves. This is not who we are. So fabulous affirmation, huh? That takes us then to something a little bit of history. Where does all this come from? So this section there's a discussion about the sources of the Pentateuch. Anyway, look, I think there is still a priestly source in the Pentateuch. It's a kind of introduction about the origins of the world. And it's a huge it tells a primordial story, so Adam and Eve up to the flood. The stories of the ancestors, that's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph, and then into the whole Pentateuch. And this chapter, our chapter, highlights the goodness of creation and the divine desire that human beings share in that goodness. It's a lovely chapter. Eh? And God brings an orderly universe out of primordial case merely by uttering a word. In the literary structure of the 6 days, the creation events in the first 3 days are related to those in the second 3. You can see that very clearly like this, look. So on day 1, light and darkness. Day 4, the sun and the moon, and our friends the stars. Day 2, the arrangement of the waters. And day 5, the fish in the waters and the birds above the waters. On day 3, the dry land and the vegetation. On day 6, the animals and the human beings. So beautifully kind of coordinated telling. And on the 7th day on which God rests, this is the climax of the account, and it falls a little bit outside the 6-day pattern or structure. So the climax is the Shabbat, the day of rest. Huh? So it's a lovely picture. When you realize that, then it's suddenly whoever put this together puts together very, very thoughtfully, and that's why you get all these repetitions and structure throughout. Huh? In the wisdom books, we'll see it in the case of Sirach when he goes down through all of creation, systematically. The technical term for such a systematic presentation is called an onomasticon, from the Greek word onoma, meaning a name. And the Bible has many onomastica, where people just go down through all of creation. Job 38:39 is a kind of onomasticon. And our story is also a kind of onomasticon. We're in a very orderly fashion, we're considering all of creation. So in other words, it's a whole mixture of stuff. It's a dialogue with mythologies from the Middle East, very clearly. It's cool wisdom reflection on onomasticon. and then it's an assertion of the goodness, beauty, and order, and all that is, and the gift of generative powers. So very powerful, and not. I mean, it unfolds very simply, but it's not simplistic at all. Marvelous bit of writing. Another comment. I wonder, would this be helpful to you? The priestly writer is very interested in the construction of the tabernacle, and the construction of the tabernacle, which is very boring for us to read, is in the writer's mind a kind of a climax. And there are intriguing parallels between the creation narrative and the creation of the tabernacle. I'll show it to you. This gives you an idea of what was going on in the writer's mind at the time of writing, as I say. In our story, God saw everything he had made, and it was very good. Moses saw that it had all done the work of the Lord had commanded. This is the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. Thus all the works of the tabernacle was finished. On the seventh day, God finished the work he had done. Moses finished the work. God blessed the seventh day. Moses blessed. So there's a huge sense that there's a connection between the creation and then the symbolic location of God in a tabernacle. And the writer connects the creation story with the story of the tabernacle in a way that's very foreign to us, perhaps. That gives you an idea of what was concerning them at the time of writing. At the time of writing, say in the exile or post-exile, they no longer had a temple in Jerusalem because it had been destroyed under the Babylonians and was then reconstructed very slowly under the Persians. And they were concerned about a place of worship. And so that's some of the anxiety of the period of writing. So if you wanted to read something kind of very approachable in all this, there's a book by a fellow called David M. Carr. It has a great subtitle, if I can read it properly, An Introduction to the Old Testament, Sacred Texts and Imperial Contexts of the Hebrew Bible. Still in print, it's about 10 years old, a very useful book. So he identifies the P source, or priestly source, is writing here, which is pretty identifiable, I think, still. The substance then is creation, flood, and covenant. That's where you find the P material, also then, of course, in Leviticus, written at the time of exile and the post-exile. So that's the exile in Babylon. That's 587 to 539 BC. This was a huge period of cataclysmic destruction, and then they had to rethink. And one of the instructive things for us today is, in this moment of collapse and destruction, they didn't simply lie down. On the contrary, they gathered up their energies and they basically created the Bible as we know it now, and they created Judaism as we know it now. Because from this period that you have Sabbath observance and the dietary laws. So the Judaism that we would recognize comes from this period. There was an earlier Sabbath, but it was a monthly festival. And it's only from the time of exile that you get a 7-day Sabbath. And the 7th day rest was unique. No other culture had a day of rest. There was no such thing as a weekend. And so they were really saying, we are not defined by our present condition. We have another identity. And so very important to be able to enact that. And so I would just kind of summarize a little bit. The P source uses Elohim for God, as we saw, produced by priests in exile as an alternative story, an alternative to another story produced by lay people, called by Carr the L source. So this is an attempt to put the sacred into position as well. They're concerned about the tabernacle, the Passover at home, circumcision, ethnic purity, so the separation of things is very important. And interestingly, when you look at the P source, the language and concerns are closest to Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah, the great prophets of the exile. 2nd Isaiah, that's 40 to 55. So in other words, the time of writing of this stuff is actually the time of Ezekiel and the time of 2nd Isaiah. And that tells you when this was written. So this isn't anciently written. It has no doubt ancient bits in it, but it's really relatively new. And especially then the Sabbath is very important to the writers of the time. So summary. This is taken from David Carr. So I'll just read it. Read in this way, Genesis 1 to 2:3 would have helped Judean exiles understand their situation in a new way. Though they might be relatively powerless vis-a-vis their Babylonian overlords, they shared with the rest of humanity a likeness to God that was seen in their bodies, a likeness that made them kings of creation. Moreover, unlike the rest of humanity, the Judean exiles acted out the similarity to God in a particular way, just as God observed a Sabbath after creating the universe, they likewise observed a Sabbath every week. Thus, this text takes an ancient practice, the Sabbath, that became more important during the exile, the Sabbath, and makes it a sign of the exile's likeness to God. So, in other words, very powerful in its context. And for me, that's a great help in putting that whole story into a particular context when it would have a big resonance for all those involved. Yes.
At some stage, we were told that the Jewish people did not want us to use the word Yahweh.
That's correct, yeah.
Why exactly?
So the question there then is, the Jewish people do not want us Christians to use the word Yahweh, which came up in the Jerusalem Bible translation. Remember, it used the word Yahweh throughout. And there's that hymn, Yahweh is the God of my salvation. They don't pronounce the name because it's too sacred. And in their Bible, they replace it with Lord all the time, the Adonai. And what they did to make sure you would do that, they put in the consonants of Yahweh with the vowels of Adonai to trigger that you would say the right thing. And in even more conservative Jewish Bibles, they take out the letters of Yahweh and they put in Hashem, which means the name. So you absolutely won't make any attempt to pronounce it and you'll say something else instead. And then out of respect for Jews are sort of offended that we bounce around the word Yahweh so lightly. And the Pontifical Biblical Commission asked us, out of respect to their sensitivities, not to use the word Yahweh as frequently as we were, or not at all really. There are pluses and minuses. One plus was of Yahweh was that it's gender free, whereas Lord is not gender free. You know, so now the Yahweh is the God of my salvation now becomes the Lord is the God of my salvation, and that's not gender free. Whereas Yahweh is sort of gender free. Anyway, that's where we are on that. But anyway, that's I hope you can see then this is a way of reading Genesis chapter 1, which is very elevating, and gives an importance to the whole coordinated existence of the world, a significant place to human beings, but not the last word. Not the last word. That's, I think, an important evolution. So, I've been talking for a very long time. We'll stop there. Did you want to ask anything or make any comment before we close? Any discoveries that might be useful for us today? Anything that strikes you? Who knows?
I didn't realise the importance of the Sabbath as, like David, what's his name said there, as a kind of an indication of our likeness to God.
Yes, that's very powerful. Yeah. In his book, he goes on to talk more and more what that likeness could mean, and he reflects on whether human beings in their physical presentation could be like God. You know, he goes on to reflect. The book is well worth getting a hold of, and it's another book, but it's very well written and considerately written. You know, and he has lots of charts and maps. It's written, I think, for undergraduates, but it's very easy to read. But it does. There's a lovely sense of the day of rest is also a copying of God and a participation in God's act of creation. Yeah, nice idea. And I love Walter Brueggemann's idea that it's not about worship; it's about stoppage, refusing to be defined by what I produce, what I have.
Maybe that's a message we could try to rediscover.
I would think.
We're very much caught up in Sundays, a day of worship.
Yeah.
Which maybe doesn't appeal to people who don't worship, but maybe we all need that stoppage.
Yeah. Like in this frame, those people who go with their kids to GA matches are observing the Sabbath perfectly well. They're practicing the stoppage. Unfortunately, for those of us who want people to go to mass.
And in South Africa, you can't do anything at all. It's so the Dutch Reformed
Yeah, sure,
so
yeah.
serious.
Yes,
like
yeah.
Calvinistic.
Yeah. Yes. My sister lived in the north of Holland. Lived in the north of Holland for a good number of years, and it was very advantageous being a Catholic because there was no one else in the swimming pool on Sundays. No one else in the swimming pool. Good. Was anything else you wanted to ask or to observe in any way? Then we leave it rest, shall we? Thank you very much. Today we have Mass at 12 in the Chapel of the Apparition. I think that's correct, isn't it? Probably 12, yeah. 25 to 12. Oh. Well, that's in 20 minutes' time, is it? So it's 25 to 12. I got the wrong time written down there then.
Oh, just today.
It's just today, is it? At 11:35. Okay. Listen, thank you very much, everybody. And thanks to everybody online for joining us. I hope you're able to enjoy the presentation. Thanks a lot, everybody.